Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Leaning In and Speaking Out. I'm Michelle Lamb and the host of the podcast, together with Jackie Kirk, my co-host. And this podcast is called Healing and Remembering Other Ways to Live, which I think is a very important topic these days. And I'm really excited to hear more about it from our guests, Rebecca and Zara. So I wonder if you could take a moment just to introduce yourself. Rebecca, would you like to go first?
Hi, I'm Rebecca Okemow. I am a Cree educator from Treaty 5 territory, currently living and working in Treaty 2. I'm a mother of 4 children. I have a 26-year-old, 14-year-old twins, and a 12-year-old. I'm also a teacher and a guidance counselor and just started a new role in language and land-based education.
That's great. Thank you. And Zara?
Hi, everyone. My name is Zara Kasamali. I'm originally from Treaty 6 in Edmonton, Alberta, moved recently to Brandon in Treaty 2 territory, and I'm working as an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at BU. And I'm really excited to have our conversation.
Me too. And Jackie, I sort of introduced you at the beginning, but do you want to add a little bit?
Sure. I'm Jackie Kirk, and I'm the chair of the Department of Leadership and Educational Administration at Brandon University. And I think this morning, I will just hope that I can find something that will be helpful personally in the conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I think that we have a lot of things to heal as we hope that we get close to the end of the pandemic. I think all of us need some healing. So I think this is a really important topic for today.
Thank you. I agree, and I'm really looking forward to this. And so I think we should set the stage a little bit first to talk about healing in the context of education. Healing is often talked about in healthcare and in other settings, but less so in education. So the first question would be, what does healing mean in the context of education?
I can go first, I guess.
Sure, thanks.
I think healing in the context of education would mean that we need to remember that we are a team. We're all there for everyone in the school. So we're there for one another, also our students, and also to support our administration. So us as staff, we can understand that our administration are people as well. We can focus on efficacy in our schools, amongst our students, amongst our staff, and amongst everyone that is there. I think it's important to come from a perspective of empathy and understanding, and having flexibility. You know, it's been very, very tough over the last couple of years, and making sure we're flexible enough and that our boundaries and expectations are not so rigid that we're not able to allow for that space of healing, that gray area where we need to be flexible in.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. That's really insightful in terms of really pondering alongside that flexibility that we so need desperately. When I think about healing, I have to say that I'm a bit of an etymology dork, and I love looking at the etymology dictionary, but I find it really interesting that healing is described as the restoration of health and wholeness. And I feel very often in schools, there tends to be a focus on the intellectual aspects of ourselves solely, and thinking about how, the spiritual, the physical, and the emotional are often overlooked in the process. And I think about how overlooking those aspects can certainly amplify matters related to any tensions that we're experiencing. Thinking about post-traumatic stress, well, then I'm hoping the end of this pandemic, and also thinking about the different fears and uncertainties that we carry, but then can be buried as a result of not honoring those different parts of ourselves. And as I share this, I'm thinking about a conversation that I had with a good friend just a couple of days ago. talking about her nephew and how he continues to carry a lot of fear as a junior high student, amidst COVID and where they are living currently still being online, but really having this fear in terms of the mortality of his parents and how he's been really carrying that inside and wondering what spaces that we can help to support and cultivate young people and support that wellness and have these truthful conversations that evoke so much vulnerability.
That's so important and heartbreaking for that boy. And it just makes me think of the context that children are growing up in, right? It's not just the pandemic. There's war and there's economic, rising inflation that's causing family stress, or there's, climate anxiety. There's all these things that are weighing heavily on children. And I really liked what you said, Rebecca, at the very beginning about how we're a team as a school or as a staff or whatever our organization might be. And it makes me think about self-care and all the kind of talk in light of this big thing. And that's important. But I also wish there was more talk about other care and creating this sense of team and a sense of wholeness, not just as individuals. And Zara, you were talking about wholeness, but this idea that we can be a whole as a team by leaning on one another and caring for one another when we're feeling those pressures. Jackie, do you want to jump in with anything there? I see you sort of looking eager. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just keep thinking about that. I don't think we know where each other is at. And I think we have a lot of trouble sort of establishing that. And I've been thinking about it personally and thinking about, my friends would never know if I was struggling with things because I keep just going through my motions, right? Like I always keep doing the same things and I have to because it's healthy for me, but it also becomes part of the mask that sort of makes it not visible. And as I, sort of do some self-reflection, then I've been thinking about, I wonder how many people that's happening to. There was lots in the media yesterday about a study that was saying that I think 34% of people between the ages of 18 and 34 maybe were struggling with mental illness now as the pandemic wears on, and that it just feels like it's never going to end, and that the constant grind is just bringing them to a point that they're unhealthy. And I thought about some of the people that I know, and because I teach in that age group, and I just kept thinking, I wouldn't know because they keep going through the regular motions, and it's hard from the outside perspective to understand. And Zara, when you talk about the 13-year-old boy, then I get thinking, yeah, it'll be the same with children. We won't know.
Do you think that maybe we've forgotten something? Like, do you think that a long time ago we would have known one another? Or do you feel like, Zara talked, or the name of this episode is Remembering Other Ways, right? And so what have we forgotten along the way that's made it into this sort of hyper individualistic, competitive way of being? Like, how can we get back to a more caring and supportive world where we do know how each other is doing?
I think just dwelling with these insights, I think a lot of the struggles that we find ourselves collectively enmeshed in is that we've really become seduced by the fallacy of thinking that we're separate from each other. And I continue to wonder if, that is connected to forgetting our sacred ecological roots and, thinking about sacred ecology and the things that gift us life, such as sun-inspired energy, the water, the wind, the ground, everything that makes life possible and that creative inspiration. But as I share this, I think about the myth of you and I, and there's actually a really beautiful poem by my favorite poet, Rumi, that I would love to share, that I think really encapsulates these sentiments. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to just share it here in the moment. So Rumi shares, faithful friend, come closer. Let go of you and I. Come quickly, you and I have to live as if you and I never heard of a you and I. And that's a poem that I continue to revisit when I think about how, as Jackie, you were saying earlier, we don't seem to have an understanding of what each other is lifting. And just thinking about what Rebecca, you were saying earlier about this as a team, a collective effort. And it seems that within the confines, if we're talking about schooling and curriculum of that neoliberal agenda, that seems to be completely overlooked and really perpetuating a lot of that imbalance that we so need to address head on.
I want to turn it over to you, Rebecca, because you are the only one of us that are in a school at this moment. And so from the schooling world, and I know, Zara, it hasn't been that long since you were teaching also, so feel free to jump in too if there's something you'd like to say. But when you think about remembering and how that implies that we've forgotten something, what do you think has been forgotten? Do you have anything to add to what Zara has said?
I think in my experience at the school, I think sometimes we forget that youth are still children, right? So they are still developing. If something has happened and has stunted their emotional growth, we have to remember that they are still children in maybe adult bodies, right? So they still need that support. They still need teachable moments. They still need us as educators to help them with the strategies they need to get through these tough times. As you were saying, like the 13-year-old boy, that fear, what strategies can we help provide him to get through those difficult moments? So not forgetting that us as educators have the tools to help others, but we also cannot forget that they're still young and that it is our job or our role to help them get through those moments, and also helping as a staff member to help those that are around us as well, and being a supportive person for those that may be having difficulties within our work environment as well.
It's such a good reminder, and we do forget, especially in the busyness of have to meet these outcomes or have to get to this goal, and it can be a really important thing to put that front and center and remind ourselves. In terms of the strategies that you talked about, are there other ways of living that could be important to consider in this kind of crazy environment that we seem to be in with this pandemic and all the upheaval that's going on in the world? What other ways of living might be important to consider, either strategies for school or more broadly?
I think one of the strategies that I constantly use in my everyday life is that knowing that I've set long-term goals or short-term goals and I'm still working for those, but making sure I'm present in today. So today is what I have. Do I have tomorrow? I'm not sure. If I wake up, yes, I do. It's being able to live in that present moment and enjoying the smallest things you have, and also being grateful for what you have in that day. If we're not able to find something to be grateful for, that should, kind of trigger that our mindset isn't in a good place, and then looking at, okay, what do I need to work on today? And then looking at the physiological parts of it. So I know, Zara, you had mentioned before the physical, the emotional, mental, and spiritual. I think it's very important. Like, I have a framework that I kind of look at sometimes in a medicine wheel that people have put in. What part of those domains have I not done today? Or having some type of framework to help us along.
Zara, do you want to jump in there?
For sure. That's really beautiful, Rebecca. Just thinking alongside what you have just shared, I think a lot about, for me, during the time the pandemic actually started, I was teaching grade 10 and 11 social studies and English language arts and ESL. And I remember so vividly before that, that many of the students that I was fortunate to come into relationship with were really struggling with, adjusting to high school, were carrying a lot of anxiety and wondering how they would be able to get through the tasks of the day with balancing their lives as new high school students, their personal things that were going on, such as, friction at home, for example, things happening with boyfriends, girlfriends, other peers, teachers, making it to swim practice and volleyball and trying to keep up academically and already worrying about what next, and that plan B, and really unable to really connect with themselves inside and be really present to the moment, Rebecca, as you highlighted. So I remember that they really initially hated me and resented the fact that we spent, a lot of time trying to do grounding activities where the self was really implicated and trying to bring forth, less distance between an objectified view of who we are and really trying to get to know who we are in relation to others. So I think without having that cultivated time, and it's so hard, I know in schools, just thinking back, recently to being in high school and having more than several moving pieces, all these things being thrown at you and so many different responsibilities, and really wanting to honor each individual as a whole being, but thinking about that importance of taking those moments, being able to have pregnant pauses and not thinking that you have to respond right away, not feeling that you have to hit every outcome that you've laid out for yourself and feeling like if you don't, that you failed. And when I think about this, I think about guidance from Elder Bob Cardinal, who's from Enoch Cree Nation in Alberta, and someone who has inspired me a lot in my own life and my daily living and my own practices. But I remember him always saying, don't rush, take time and slow down. And of course, we know in schools that is so difficult to do. It seems like that's such a heavy juxtaposition to the realities, but some of the things that we tried to do was to slow down in that way, to dwell when things called our attention. We used to do a lot of different sorts of reflective practice, free writing, arts-based approaches. And one of the things that I've been carrying forth into, post-secondary teaching is also being able to have that time in class to be quiet, especially now, even if it means 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of class, and honoring that practice, whether it's through different meditative practices, any spiritual practices that might resonate with students or not, anything that can bring you peace and grounding in your own life, and remembering that it's okay to feel out of balance, and that that's always a process that's elusive and that we're working towards together.
Makes me wonder, I know there's so many spiritual traditions that have that kind of practice of centering in the moment, and they call it different things, but it seems like a thread through the different religions that I know. And it makes me wonder, as we're on this kind of treadmill, and schools are a good example, but they're not the exception, I don't think. I think in many careers, people feel like what you were saying earlier, Jackie, like just have to keep going through the motions, even if you're not doing okay. And so I wonder if, because we're feeling like we need to keep going, and you kind of numb inside or just don't think about how you're doing inside in order to keep performing, how can schools, in light of that sort of ethos, how can schools support connections to a more embodied way of knowing? How can they bring students back into that place where they recognize that they're not okay, or they have skills to know what to do when they're not okay? How can schools do that? I think we've touched on it a little bit, but let's flesh it out a little more. And Jackie, I want to hear from you too, because as an administrator, your view might be a little different. So chime in too if you can.
I think I'll just, I don't, I like, I think I'll just go with that it's super important to connect your body and your mind. So your thoughts and how your body is feeling. It's, we're not always aware of where we're tense, or we're not always aware of the physiological reaction we have to something. So I think being able to foster those connections amongst students, and then teach them how to do that, or give them the opportunities to have those experiences, to know how to do that, or even be aware of the language, or providing those types of interactions and situations. So I was a phys ed teacher. If I noticed kids were super tired and they were coming in, they're like, oh, I don't want to do gym today because I played hockey until 11 p.m. last night. So some days I would pull out the mats and then we would do a meditative activity before we actually started in phys ed, because they needed to take care of their body. And they were kids that were active right before the pandemic, and they needed this time. But then also after the pandemic, during, this was the only time they actually got to be physically active, because so many of the sports and things were taken away. So I manage the time based on what is happening with the students, or whatever is happening with them. It's paying attention to them, but also just providing those opportunities and strategies for students so they can make those connections, mind and body connection.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. Just so beautifully shared. And when I'm thinking about your insights with that, restoring that mind and body connection, I think a lot about, those challenges of being able to really identify within your body what you're feeling, since we're so accustomed to living in our heads. And I know for myself, I was really guilty of that for a large part of my life. I didn't really realize what I was overlooking in my day-to-day life and living, and didn't realize the harm that it was doing to myself and the relationships alongside others that I care about so much. And I think that it took really remembering how to realize that we do have other forms of knowledge that are just as important as our intellectual understandings. And I think about exercises, which initially can be seen as hokey when it's something that we're not necessarily accustomed to or familiar with, but having those spaces in schools where it's not abnormal to have that check-in, to be able to say, where are we feeling something in our bodies? Is it sitting in our stomachs? Is it sitting deep in our chest? Is something really weighing in on our head? What information or understanding is this trying to give us here and now in the moment? And really, supporting that guidance that if we're not well in ourselves, that translates into everything that we do, that comes out in our actions, in our words, and how we're coming into relationship. And, when you were talking about, a medicine wheel model, Rebecca, I was also thinking about Elder Bob's guidance again, and how one of the things that he would always tell us was that, keep things simple, don't overcomplicate. And for me, I always like to talk about how I've often gotten in my own way and by over complexifying things that really didn't need to be, or thinking that I couldn't honor process alongside my students. And when I say this, I think about, that importance of vulnerability, and that, as educators and school leaders, administrators, that it's so important to show who we are to our students, and that we don't have it all figured out, and that we're alongside honoring the moment here and now. And thinking about how, I love how Brene Brown says it, that when we numb pain, we also numb joy. So really thinking about that balance and, supporting that balance, but bringing it back to Elder Bob, one of the things that he inspired through, pre-interpretations or notions of medicine wheel teachings or 4 directions teachings was, guiding students to recover those different dimensions of themselves through, let's say, getting them to paint where they see themselves honoring those different aspects in their life and being really able to visualize and then have that understanding of what's being perhaps overlooked or left out and the consequences of that perhaps.
Thanks, Zara. Jackie, anything to add there?
Sure. You're making me think a lot about schools, and I think teachers have changed. I think teachers are getting better. I see lots of my young pre-service teachers that are thinking about meditation in their classrooms and thinking about how they can coach students to have some of those skills as they're growing up, so that when they get to be 13 years old, that they have some skills already to address some of those uncomfortable feelings. And I think about myself as a young teacher, and I am an extreme extrovert, and I like noise and I like action and I like things to be really exciting. But I think one of the things that I've learned as I've matured is that quiet is good. And I like what you said, Zara, about having moments in your classroom that are quiet. In the last few years, when I've been teaching classroom management, I always talk to my students about that. And I do it in that class because it's so calming. And, we become calm with each other, right? So I think sometimes we talk and we make noise and we do silly things because we're uncomfortable being within that space together. And being quiet together changes that relationship. And I think sometimes we need to think more about, and I think that for teachers, I think there's other teachers that are like me that just don't get it quite. And I think that as leaders and administrators, we need to think about that group of people and about how we can coach them and help them, because it's good personally, right? And so you have the healthier teacher and you'll have healthier students. But I think lots of those things that you're talking about are so important for teachers to learn. And some are really good at it. And I think more and more are better at it. But some of us had a ways to go.
I think you're totally right, Jackie, that it is starting to make its way into a more mainstream world. I've been in a few meetings recently where the facilitator started, and this is on Zoom, but the facilitator started with grounding activities. And I've had a few experiences like this, whether it's like, let's all close our eyes and take 3 deep breaths, or let's all look beyond our computers and identify something that can bring you into the room. Those kinds of activities. The first time I experienced it, I was like, what are we doing? Like, this is like Zoom work meeting. Let's, but I love it now. I feel like it is so calming, and it does sort of bring everyone into the space in a different way. And so I'm like you, Jackie, it was something I needed to practice to feel more comfortable, but definitely can see the benefit now, and would like to bring that into other spaces that I inhabit too. So when we're thinking about bringing it back to sort of full circle to that idea of being a team and caring for one another, how can we do that? Let's make it really practical. How can we care for both ourselves and for each other during the crazy times that we're living in? Any ideas, any thoughts?
Well, I'll start, because
Yeah,
I think we need to make the assumption that the people around us are not okay, that the people around us are struggling. And I think we need to treat them with kindness and with reverence and with love, I think. And I think we need to be vulnerable enough and have enough courage to be with them that way. And to, like Zara said, we need to forget that there was a you and me, or a you and I. I think that's really.
I love that.
We're all at the end of the we're all 2 years into the pandemic, and there's not very many healthy people.
I agree that, we should assume that people are not okay with the pandemic, and some have struggled and some have, maybe suffered a little bit more than others, either by, just the isolation, very extroverted people that have turned, maybe are very introverted now, or have experienced or lived with some fear. So I think reaching out is super important at this time, checking in with people that we know, and also offering, are you okay? Would you like to go out for a walk today? Or, something that maybe is out of the norm. If we're all sitting back waiting for someone to make that offer, maybe we need to step out of our comfort zone and look after our neighbor a little bit more than we have in the past.
Oh, thank you for that, Rebecca. I think a lot about, and just what Jackie said earlier about assuming that people are not doing well. And I think about, restoring what it means to be fully human, and that sometimes there can be a tendency to treat our daily interactions as a very clinical, empty affair. And just assuming that, oh, I'm here to do my job, or I'm here to be a student, and that's it, and nothing more. But thinking about, what is overlooked in that process and what can really cause harm and further amplify a lot of pain that we might be assuming. And really thinking about, if we're going back to that vulnerability, some things that we think or have become comfortable with assuming that we can't address, or that we cannot talk about, I guess, in relation to classroom spaces, when we're maybe thinking about policy, or even thinking about assessments. Oh, this isn't going to fly. This isn't going to support those standardized assessments that we need to have students prepared for. And when I think about this, I think a lot about, the extent to which students I have come alongside in high school particularly, and pre-service teachers that I have worked with for the last 10 years, and thinking about the extent to which, having conversations that really address, pain that we experience in different ways. How much is that actually brought in our daily life and living? And there often tends to be a focus on being happy, that this sense of we really need to be happy all the time, and that's going to solve all our problems. But when I think about, guidance from Rumi again, I'm going to share one small poem that's entitled Pain. And he shared that, how do you ever expect for your heart to become polished like a mirror without putting up with the pain of polish? So I think about that sense of avoidance, and thinking about not paying attention to our body knowledge, and remembering that, of course, as you remember, Rebecca, that you were saying earlier, we have those physiological responses, those things that we are carrying deep inside that need to be addressed, and that this could be an opportunity as we find ourselves, continue to be enmeshed in war and so many things being thrown at us, to really reconceptualize what pain means and what it can teach us. That it doesn't have to be a swear word, so to speak, something that we have to, just bury under the rug.
Thanks for that, Zara. We're almost nearing our time. And there was a little part of me that was like, oh, I should ask some kind of question about what gives you hope. And we'll end. But then given what you just said, Zara, I won't sort of be tempted to tie it up with a nice, happy bow. And I think it might be better. Is there one more poem that you really love that you'd like to share with us? And we could end it that way.
Sure.
I put you right on the spot, but yeah, I see your book there.
All good. I'm just trying to find one that I really, really like. And it's actually called, this is a good one to leave off on, but it's by the poet Attar, and it's called Becoming Whole. If you are a whole human, see all, seek all, become all, be all, choose all.
Thank you for that. Are there any final thoughts before we wrap up? Rebecca, Jackie, Zara?
Just this week for myself, I think that the care for ourselves is to find joy in the mundane. My coffee, does it taste good this morning? Was my drive to work, even though I drive half an hour each way every day, the sunrise or the sunset is always different, and the sky's always a different color. Did I see a moose today on my drive to work? And so even though that hour every day is always the same, it isn't always the same. And so taking that time to really understand that each day has some joy you can find within it. So find the joy in the mundane. And that's how we can start to live a little bit happier, healthier life.
Jackie, don't you feel like we're so blessed with these wise women on our episode today? I feel like what a great way to start our day. I'm enjoying.
I'm so thankful that you came to join us.
Me too.
This has been a great conversation. And yeah, just thanks so much for coming to the show and to participating with us. And I think it'll be a valuable episode for the people who listen. So thanks so much.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us. It's really been an honor and a good way to begin the day.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thank you.